On the map, Siberia looks like a single block of cold. In reality, it is a vast world about 13.1 million square kilometers, nearly 9% of Earth's land surface so big the horizon can feel endless even from a moving train. And in places known for their harsh, frigid winters, temperatures have been recorded at around minus 68 degrees Celsius to minus 71 degrees Celsius, where even breath can freeze in midair. But the most alarming truth lies deep beneath the surface. Permafrost covers about 65% of Russia's land area, and that frozen certainty is beginning to melt. So what happens when a land built on ice starts to move quietly, relentlessly, beneath everything that lives on it? To understand Siberia, the camera has to start with scale, not the kind measured in kilometers, but in time. This is a region where the ground remembers ancient climates, where rivers act like moving borders, and where the land can look perfectly still while it is slowly changing from below. In western Siberia, the earth lays itself out like an unfinished sentence. The West Siberian Plain, one of the world's largest stretches of continuous flatland. It spans roughly 3.0 million kilometers, squeezed between the Ural Mountains to the west and the Yenisei Basin to the east, sloping so gently northward that water can hesitate spread and refuse to drain. That hesitation is not just geography, it is a climate story. Long winters lock the surface, spring arrives fast, and meltwater floods wide, shallow basins. Over thousands of years, this rhythm helps build enormous wetlands and peatlands, places where plant matter piles up faster than it can decay. In a documentary lens, it reads like a quiet paradox, a land that looks dry and empty from above, yet holds vast hidden reservoirs of water and carbon in the dark soil. Farther east, the landscape begins to rise and harden. Plateaus and ancient rock reveal themselves, and the sense of flat forever breaks into ridges, river valleys, and long, lonely horizons. But even here, the defining feature is not only what can be seen, it is what stays frozen. Permafrost covers about 65% of Russia's territory, turning the ground into something like a sleeping foundation stable when cold, unpredictable when warming. This is why Siberian cities and roads often feel engineered against nature rather than built upon it. In permafrost regions, builders elevate structures, insulate the earth, and treat heat like a threat. The active layer on top may thaw each summer and refreeze in winter, a shallow pulse that decides whether a road holds firm or warps, whether a building stays level or begins a slow tilt. And if that pulse deepens, if thaw reaches farther down, what does solid ground even mean anymore? Then there is Baikal, Siberia's most haunting contradiction. Lake Baikal sits in the southeast like a blue fracture in the continent, the oldest about 25 million years, and deepest lake on Earth, about 1,700 meters, containing roughly 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. It is not simply a lake, it is a geological statement. Its great depth comes from a rift, an opening in the Earth's crust, that has been pulling apart over immense spans of time. The shoreline looks calm, but the basin speaks of tension and movement of a planet that reshapes itself in increments too slow for human eyes. Standing there, the story shifts. Siberia is not only cold, it is ancient dynamic and still unfinished, like a continent caught mid-breath. Climate in Siberia is not background, it is architecture. Distance from oceans creates a hard continental pattern, winters that dominate summers that arrive briefly, but can be surprisingly intense, and temperature swings that feel like a test of endurance. The north leans into the Arctic, the south edges toward steppe and mountains. Between them, the great river systems, names that sound like entire chapters, carry Siberia's seasons downhill toward the polar sea. On the West Siberian plain, rivers can widen into floodplains so broad that the boundary between river and land becomes a blur. In a warm spell, what looked like firm ground can turn into a shallow inland sea. In a cold snap, the same surface becomes a silent road. This seasonal switch from waterway to highway and back again has shaped migration routes, settlement patterns, and the very logic of survival. But the most cinematic moment is often the simplest. The land's texture changes. Snow hides the details. Ice seals the rivers. The horizon becomes a clean line, and the viewer could be tricked into believing Siberia is a blank canvas. Yet underneath the system is precise permafrost, storing centuries of frozen history. Peatlands, collecting slow layers of organic time. A rift lake, holding a fifth of the planet's unfrozen freshwater like a locked vault. And that is the tension this film will keep returning to. Siberia was shaped by long cold, by flatlands that trap water, by ancient fractures that created impossible depth, and by frozen ground that made the modern world build carefully, sometimes arrogantly. on top of ice. When the climate nudges even slightly warmer, which parts of this landscape remain resilient and which parts begin to unravel first? Siberia is often described as empty, but that word only makes sense from a distance, an airplane window, a map, a simplified imagination. On the ground, Siberia is loud with life, just not in the way a tropical forest is loud. Here survival speaks in quieter languages. The creak of frozen trees, the hush of snowfall, absorbing sound, the sudden burst of wings when something unseen decides it has waited long enough. The great backbone of this living world is the taiga, the boreal forest, an ocean of conifers and hardy deciduous trees that stretches so far it begins to feel like a different definition of infinity. In Russia, the taiga runs for about 800 kilometers from the Pacific edge of the continent toward the Ural Mountains. It is not a single uniform forest. It changes by latitude, by soil, by the hidden rules of permafrost, by fire, by wind. In some zones, larch dominates trees that drop their needles, as if winter is too expensive to carry year-round. In others, darker conifers hold their green like stubborn flags against the cold. The undergrowth can be sparse, the light thin, and yet this simplicity is a strategy. Fewer moving parts, less water lost, less energy wasted. Then comes the seasonal miracle. Summer arrives quickly sometimes with startling warmth, and the forest wakes up all at once. Insects explode into motion. Migratory birds arrive like a promise kept. Wetlands breathe out mist at dawn. And as the active layer of soil thaws on top of deeper frozen ground, the taiga becomes a giant sponge, holding water, feeding rivers, creating the moody, reflective landscapes that look almost unreal on camera. But the taiga is only one chapter. Push north, and the trees begin to thin, shrinking and spacing out until the forest gives way to tundra, a world of low shrubs, mosses, lichens, and open sky. Push south, and the story shifts again. The forest loosens grasslands, and steppe influences creep in, and mountains begin to carve their own microclimates. Siberia is not a single ecosystem. It is a corridor of ecosystems stacked like layers of climate history. And the animals, they are not merely inhabitants. They are engineers of movement, rhythm, and balance. Reindeer and elk turn distance into survival cross and wide spaces, because standing still is a risk. Wolves and bears are not just predators. They are the pressure that keeps herds alert and landscapes dynamic. Smaller animals, like sable foxes and countless rodents, become the silent gears that keep food webs turning through the long winter. The viewer is invited to feel the logic behind it all. In Siberia, nothing lives casually. Everything is built around the question, how will it survive when the world goes dark and cold again? Nowhere does Siberia's biodiversity feel more like a revelation than at Lake Baikal, a freshwater world so old and so deep that it behaves like its own planet. UNESCO describes Baikal as the oldest and deepest lake on Earth, holding nearly 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater reserve, and famous for an outstanding variety of endemic life found nowhere else. That single word, endemic, changes everything because it means isolation. It means time. It means evolution had room to experiment without interruption. In a travel documentary, Baikal can be framed like a living archive, a place where the cold is not only a force of hardship, but also a force of preservation. In winter, the lake's surface freezes into an immense sheet of ice that can crack with thunder-like echoes. Under that ice, life continues in slow motion. The water is famously clear in places, and the light that filters down can feel surgical, revealing a world that looks almost too pristine to be real. Baikal's endemic life is not just a scientific detail, it is a narrative tool. It allows the film to ask deeper questions. If a lake can carry evolutionary secrets for millions of years, what does it mean when modern pressure arrives in just a few decades? If water here is a global reserve, who is responsible for protecting it? And then the story widens again, back to the forests and the edges where the wild touches human life. In the Russian Far East, still part of the wider Siberian imagination, one animal becomes a symbol so powerful it can bend the entire tone of the film, the Amur Siberian tiger. It is the kind of creature that turns the taiga into a stage of tension. And in recent years, reporting has described a rise in tiger-human encounters in villages linked to ecological disruption and prey shortages, fueling fear and conflict at the boundary between forest and settlement. This is not presented as a simple danger story. It is presented as a relationship story. Because when a top predator appears where people live, it is rarely random. It can be a signal. Something in the ecosystem is shifting food, webs bending forests, changing winters, and disease patterns disrupting prey. The tiger becomes a messenger of imbalance, and the documentary lens can hold that complexity without turning the animal into a villain. Siberia's biodiversity, then, is not only about lists of species. It is about adaptation, how life edits itself to endure cold distance and scarcity. It is about interdependence, how wetlands feed rivers, how forests moderate climate, how predators shape prey, how a lake can become a sanctuary for evolution. And it is about fragility disguised as strength, because the same ecosystems that have survived brutal winters can still be vulnerable to rapid change. In Siberia, the sensory world of nature is part of the science. The audience should feel it, the way cold air sharpens every sound, the way snow can erase footprints and yet make tracks easier to read, the way wind can turn a simple tree line into something that looks like a living wall. The camera can linger on small details that reveal survival strategies, a tree's bark pattern, the angle of a nest built low to avoid wind, the way animals conserve motion like a currency. And this is where the documentary's pacing matters. Siberia teaches patience. It asks the viewer to slow down enough to notice that life here isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply persistent. A forest that looks still is actually counting time in seasons. A frozen lake is not dead. It is sleeping with its eyes open. A tundra plain that looks barren is quietly storing the building blocks of future blooms. So the section closes not with a conclusion, but with a doorway. If Siberia's ecosystems have been shaped by cold and time by forests stretching thousands of kilometers, and by a lake that holds a fifth of the world's unfrozen freshwater, what happens when the pace of change becomes faster than evolution's ability to adjust? Before Siberia becomes a story of nations and railways, it is a story of footsteps, some so old they feel almost impossible to imagine. This is one of the places where human history is not a neat timeline, but a layered map. Modern humans, archaic humans, and cultures that learn to live with cold as if it were a permanent law. A turning point in that deep time comes from Western Siberia. A 45,000-year-old modern human genome sequenced from remains found there, suggesting a population that lived before or alongside the split between Western and Eastern Eurasian populations. It is not just a scientific milestone. In the documentary's language, it's a reminder that Siberia was never empty waiting to be discovered. People were here astonishingly early, watching ice advance and retreat tracking animals across open steppe, reading the land the way later generations would read a river's freeze. Then the narrative widens to the Altai Mountains, where a cave holds an even stranger echo of humanity, Denisova Cave. The site became globally known after bone fragments found in 2008 were shown by 2010 to belong to a distinct archaic human group, the Denisovans, named after the cave itself. The film does not need to drown in genetics to make the point. What matters is the feeling Siberia is one of the few places on Earth where different human lineages left overlapping traces, proof that being human was never just one straight road. And far to the north, above the Arctic Circle, another archaeological signal stands like a flare in the darkness. The Yana rhinoceros horn site on the Yana River, documented as a Paleolithic settlement dating to around 27,000 radiocarbon years, before present, remarkably early for such a high latitude. This is where the audience should feel the shock not from spectacle, but from capability. A settlement in the high Arctic that long ago suggests planning technology, social cooperation people who didn't merely endure Siberia, but actively learned it. So the first human chapter of Siberia is not a single origin story. It's a braided one. Ancient migrations, long winters, shared shelters, and cultures shaped by a truth that never changes. Out here, the environment is never background. As time moves closer to the present, Siberia becomes a mosaic of indigenous peoples and lifeways, each tied to a particular landscape, each carrying knowledge that functions like an invisible survival tool. Encyclopedia Britannica describes many Siberian groups as relying on reindeer herding or fishing, with others hunting fur-bearing animals. Historically, some maintained seasonal dwellings and shamanism was widespread. This is the documentary's human heartbeat, the idea that culture is not decoration added onto nature, but an operating system built for it. In the far north and northwest, the Nenets stand as one of the most emblematic examples. Britannica notes the Nenets as reindeer pastoralists, fishermen, and hunters of the tundra. In the film's visuals, their story can be told through motion. The long migration across open land, the conical tents, chum, the herds that seem to flow like living weather. And there is a powerful thematic alignment here. Some accounts even translate Yamal as the edge of the world, a phrase that feels almost written for the world's edge itself. It's a reminder that the edge is not only a place, it's a way of life. Modern research also shows how this life continues under pressure. A 2023 paper in Ecology and Society describes the Yamal Peninsula as home to the largest herd of domesticated reindeer, alongside major gas extraction, and notes that among Nenets in the region, thousands still herd reindeer nomadically. The documentary can hold both truths at once: the elegance of tradition and the modern forces cutting into pasture and migration routes. Farther south in Siberia's mountainous taiga zones, the Evenki represent a different kind of reindeer culture, less about vast tundra herds and more about forest movement. Cultural survival describes Evenki taiga-type reindeer herding, sometimes called Evenki, or Tungus-type herding. Here, reindeer are not only food or wealth. They are transport companions, the difference between being trapped and being mobile in a forest that can swallow distances. And then there are the Saka Yakut, whose story complicates every stereotype about Arctic life. Britannica notes that despite the climate, the Saka maintained an economy based on raising cattle reindeer and horses with fishing as a major activity. an adaptation that sounds almost impossible until the camera shows it. This is where Siberia's human story becomes intensely visual horses, breathing steam in sub-zero air livestock, sheltered and fed through long winters, food systems designed around scarcity and timing. What unites these cultures is not a single religion or language. It is an approach to reality. In many Siberian traditions, the land is not inert property. It is an active presence, something to negotiate with, respect, interpret. That mindset is not romantic. It's practical. In a place where a storm can erase tracks, where a river can become a road, and where frost can punish a single mistake, humility becomes a survival skill. This is also where Siberia's early human chapter connects to the Great Migration Corridor of the Ice Age world. During periods of low sea level, the region of Beringia emerged, extending between Siberia and Alaska. Scientific reporting from the U.S. National Science Foundation has highlighted research suggesting the land bridge may have appeared around 35,700 years ago, later than previously assumed, narrowing the window for migrations on foot. This doesn't need to become an argument about exact routes. The documentary can treat it as a powerful idea. Siberia was not the end of the world. It was a crossroads at the edge of two continents, and that changes the emotional tone, because it suggests that the people of Siberia were never living at the margins of history. They were living inside one of its main corridors, shaped by cold yes, but also shaping movement exchange and the human story across the Northern Hemisphere. So the question becomes sharper and more personal. If Siberian cultures were built on movement timing and respect for the land, what happens when the land itself begins to change faster than tradition can adapt? Siberia did not enter written history as a single event. It arrived like a tide, slow, relentless, and carried by rivers. In the late 1500s, the first major turning point came when the Russian push east crossed the Urals and collided with the Khanate of Siberia. Accounts of the conquest tie its decisive early phase to the Cossack leader Yermak Timofeyevich, with the capture of Sibir Kashlik, commonly dated to 1582, often treated as the symbolic beginning of Russia's conquest of Siberia. On film, this moment should not be staged as a clean victory. It should be framed as the opening of a long frontier logic control. The waterways build winter outposts and turn distance into an administrative system. Over the following decades, Russian expansion relied on a network of forts, ostrogs, and seasonal stations placed at key river junctions and portages, strategic points where movement could be monitored and tribute could be collected. That tribute had a name: yasak, a fur tax demanded from many indigenous groups, an economic engine that transformed Siberia into a vast extraction zone long before oil or gas. The camera should linger on the real mechanism of empire here. Not grand capitals, but frozen river crossings, stockades, and trading posts, where the world's softest wealth sable fox and other furs was converted into power. The frontier moved by seasons. Rivers were highways in summer. In winter, the same rivers became roads of ice, and each outpost pushed the boundary farther east, not just in miles, but in influence. And yet Siberia refused to be fully known. It remained a place that swallowed maps. That is why the next chapter belongs to explorers men who followed rivers to their ends and then kept going into blank space. One of the starkest examples is Semyon Dezhnev, a Russian explorer who in 1648 sailed from the Arctic Ocean region and is widely credited as the first European to pass through what is now called the Bering Strait, decades before Vitus Bering's later expedition made the passage famous. In documentary pacing, Dezhnev's voyage is not only geography, it's psychology. The Arctic coast is not a route in any comfortable sense. It is ice fog, sudden storms, and shoreline that offers no shelter. It asks a question the film can quietly repeat: what kind of belief convinces people to keep moving when the world is trying to stop them? As centuries turned, Siberia shifted from frontier to corridor. The defining symbol of that transformation is steel laid across forest, swamp, mountain, and permafrost. Construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad began in 1891, an attempt to stitch the empire together from west to east. Britannica describes the work, proceeding in major stretches, Chelyabinsk to the Ob River, then toward Yakutsk on Lake Baikal, then onward to the Pacific, built in overlapping phases that gradually turned Siberia from a distance into a line you could travel. And the scale of that line is part of its myth. The Trans-Siberian is often cited as over 9,289 kilometers, widely described as the longest railway line in the world. On screen, the railway should be treated like a character with two faces. One face is Wonder 8 time zones, endless birch forests, the sudden blue shock of Baikal stations that feel like islands in a sea of trees. The other face is consequence, because rails do not only carry passengers, they carry extraction, migration, military logistics, and the power to reshape local economies overnight. Some towns became living evidence of that shift. Chita, for instance, was founded earlier as a wintering camp and later grew as a trade center. Britannica notes that a major spur to its growth came with the arrival of the Trans-Siberian Railroad around 1900. This is the pattern the film can show again and again. A settlement becomes a node becomes a city, and the empty begins to fill, sometimes with opportunity, sometimes with pressure. Then history darkens. In the 20th century, Siberia's remoteness became useful in another way, not for exploration, but for isolation. The Soviet Gulag system is widely described as a network of forced labor camps, and Siberia's harsh geography made it a central stage for that machinery. To speak of Siberian development without acknowledging forced labor would make the documentary dishonest, because some of the region's most important industrial centers were built at unimaginable human cost. Few places embody this contradiction more sharply than Norilsk, a city built above immense mineral wealth and also built on suffering. Norilsk sits atop some of the world's largest nickel deposits, and mining became the city's reason to exist. But its origins are inseparable from the camp system. Historical reporting and scholarship describe how Norilsk was developed from the mid-1930s with the use of Norilsk forced labor. Research documents that the Norilsk camp was created in 1935 and operated for decades, shaping the city and its industrial complex. This is where the documentary's tone should shift quietly, respectfully. The camera can show smokestacks and snow. It can show metal plants rising out of tundra. And then it can ask the question that stays under the surface of progress in Siberia: how much of what stands here was built because people chose to come, and how much was built because people were sent even after the Trans-Siberian Siberia demanded more lines, alternative arteries that could bypass strategic choke points and unlock new resource zones. The Soviet response was the Baikal-Amur mainline BAM, a massive rail project across eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East. A declassified CIA document notes Soviet claims that they completed track laying on the BAM on 29 September 1984. Descriptions of the BAM emphasize the extreme engineering challenges, terrain weather, and sections running over permafrost, where the land itself is unstable when warming begins. In film language, BAM is more than infrastructure. It's an argument with the earth. Bridges, tunnels, and long cuts through wilderness announce a belief that anything can be conquered with enough steel and manpower. Yet the permafrost beneath those tracks becomes the documentary's recurring tension. Again, foundations that once seemed permanent now look conditional. So, Siberia's historical development is not a straight climb from unknown to modern. It is a loop of motives, fur power, survival, industry control, and each era leaves marks that the landscape still carries. Empires came for wealth. States came for strategy. People came for work, or were pushed by circumstance, or were forced. Railways came to bind it all together, and in doing so, they changed the meaning of distance forever. And that raises the next doorway question for the film. When Siberia's story has so often been written by outsiders, explorers, empires, engineers, what does it look like when the lens turns back to the present and listens to the people who still call this cold, immense land home? In the modern era, Siberia is no longer a blank on the map. It is a working engine of minerals, oil, and gas timber shipping corridors and cities that keep their lights on through winters that still feel mythic. But the most important modern change isn't always visible from a skyline. It happens in the soil. Across large parts of the region, permafrost is thawing, and what was once stable cold is turning into a moving foundation. Reuters reported estimates that Russia could face around 7 trillion rubles in infrastructure damage by 2050 if warming continues, citing Yakutsk's Melnikov Permafrost Institute. Another Reuters report summarizing scientific findings warned that thawing permafrost could put up to 50% of Arctic infrastructure at high risk of damage by 2050, requiring massive maintenance and repair. This is where the documentary lens should slow down and get intimate. Because infrastructure risk is not just a statistic, it is a cracked apartment wall, a leaning school, a road that ripples like fabric when the ground settles. In Yakutia, for example, journalists have described landscapes forming into strange mounds and depressions as ice wedges melt, and the surface collapses, signs of a ground that is changing shape. And in cities built on continuous permafrost, buildings are often designed to keep heat away from the soil, raised, ventilated, engineered to protect the frozen ground beneath. On camera, this becomes a quiet thriller. The enemy is not a storm, but a slow shift. The ground that once acted like concrete begins to behave like thawing memory. Pipes and roads are stressed. Repairs become routine. And the psychological weight is real, because when a home starts to crack, people do not just lose property. They lose certainty. So modern Siberia asks a new question, sharper than any map. How do you build a future on land that is no longer reliably frozen? Then, there is the second modern force fire. Siberia's forests and tundra have always burned. But in recent years, the scale and intensity have become a global concern, not only because of the land burned, but because of what the smoke does to air quality across vast distances. Reuters reported in July 2024 that Russia's state forest agency was fighting hundreds of blazes across multiple regions during another unusually hot summer, echoing a pattern of severe fire seasons after millions of hectares had burned in previous years. And in 2025, Copernicus's CAMS, the EU's atmospheric monitoring service, highlighted intense wildfire activity in the first half of the year in several regions worldwide, including boreal forests of Russia, emphasizing the air quality impacts and long-range smoke transport. For a documentary, this is where Siberia stops being remote, because smoke doesn't respect borders. A fire deep in taiga can become haze over a city, then drift for thousands of kilometers like a moving weather system. The film can show the paradox, a land of cold, increasingly defined by heat-driven emergencies. And industry adds a third pressure pollution events that reveal how fragile the Arctic and subarctic environment can be when something goes wrong. The Norilsk diesel spill in May 2020 is one of the most infamous examples. Europe's JRC Initech database summarizes that a catastrophic tank failure led to about 17,500 tons, around 21,000 cubic meters of diesel spilling onto land and into local rivers. Nornickel. The company involved has published ongoing cleanup updates and described land rehabilitation work continuing years after the accident. This is not included to pile on blame. It's included because it reveals Siberia's modern dilemma. The region's wealth is deeply tied to extractive systems, yet its ecosystems can be slow to recover. Cold can preserve life, but it can also preserve damage. And in a warming climate, the same frozen conditions that once stabilized industrial infrastructure may become another source of risk. Now, the lens turns to one of Siberia's most sacred natural icons, Lake Baikal. Recent UNESCO documentation has warned of long-term degradation of water quality and persistent and increasing human pressure, particularly linked to pollution and tourism development, alongside governance and management concerns. IUCN's World Heritage Outlook also notes ongoing pollution and emerging threats, such as large-scale tourism development. So modern Siberia becomes a balancing act. Keep communities employed, keep towns alive, keep engines running, without turning the very landscapes that define Siberia into a casualty of its own development. And the film can ask, without preaching, if Baikal is a global freshwater treasure, what does responsible growth actually look like on its shores? Yet Siberia is not only crisis. It is also culture alive, adapting, refusing to be reduced to hardship. In Yakutsk, the Ishyak Summer Festival celebrates renewal after the long winter, a reminder that Siberian identity isn't built only on endurance, but on rhythm, the return of warmth, the return of community, the return of song and ceremony. And in the north, indigenous lifeways continue to navigate modern pressures. A 2023 paper in Ecology and Society describes how the Yamal Peninsula holds the largest herd of domesticated reindeer, while also being a major gas extraction region, placing tradition and industry in direct negotiation on the same land. So this section ends with a human-facing question, the kind that belongs to the world's edge. When the ground thaws, when forests burn, when development presses outward, what does it mean to belong to Siberia now? And who gets to decide what Siberia becomes next? Siberia is often spoken of like a distant backdrop, an endless cold beyond the last city lights. But by the time the journey reaches its end, it becomes clear that Siberia is not a backdrop at all. It is a living system on a planetary scale, forests that stretch for thousands of kilometers, wetlands and rivers that breathe with the seasons, and a frozen foundation that has held the region's weight for centuries. And then there is Baikal, ancient, deep, and irreplaceable, holding a vast share of the world's unfrozen freshwater like a quiet inheritance. Yet the story also carries a warning, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Permafrost is thawing, and with it comes a future where roads, homes, and entire cities may have to renegotiate their relationship with the ground. Wildfires have grown into seasons that shape air across continents. Industrial accidents have shown how fragile northern environments can be when something fails. And even Baikal, this near-mythic lake, faces growing pressure from pollution and tourism development, according to UNESCO and other conservation assessments. But Siberia is not only a story about danger, it is a story about people, about cultures that learn to read snow like a language, to navigate river ice roads, to keep traditions alive in places the world once called unlivable. It is a story about resilience that doesn't look heroic in the Hollywood sense, because here, resilience is often quiet. It's a daily discipline, a seasonal rhythm, a refusal to stop belonging. So what does this film ask of the viewer? Not guilt. Not a simple conclusion. It asks for attention and for respect. If you ever travel here, let the journey be more than a checklist. Choose routes and guides that value local knowledge. Treat protected places like Baikal as living systems, not photo backdrops. Learn the difference between wild and empty, and remember that many Siberian landscapes have been homelands for thousands of years. In the end, the world's edge is not a border drawn on a map. It is the moment we realize that the farthest places are still connected to us through air, water, climate, and time. And the final question Siberia leaves behind is simple and difficult. If the ground beneath this immense land is changing, what kind of world are we choosing to build on top of it?